How deep in the brain can you currently go and eventually go? Let's say on the Neuralink side, it seems the deeper you go in the brain, the more challenging it becomes.
Yeah. So talking broadly about neurosurgery, we can get anywhere. It's routine for me to put deep brain stimulating electrodes near the very bottom of the brain, entering from the top and passing about a 2 millimeter wire all the way into the bottom of the brain. And that's not revolutionary. A lot of people do that. And we can do that with very high precision. I use a robot from Globus to do that surgery, several times a month. It's pretty routine.
What are your eyes in that situation? What are you seeing? What kind of technology can you use to visualize where you are to light your way?
Yeah, so it's a cool process on the software side. You take a preoperative MRI that's extremely high resolution data of the entire brain. You put the patient to sleep, put their head in a frame that holds the skull very rigidly, and then you take a CT scan of their head while they're asleep with that frame on, and then merge the MRI and the CT in software. You have a plan based on the MRI where you can see these nuclei deep in the brain. You can't see them on CT, but if you trust the merging of the two images, then you indirectly know on the CT where that is, and therefore indirectly know where, in reference to the titanium frame screwed to their head, those targets are. And so this is 60s technology to manually compute trajectories given the entry point and target, and dial in some goofy looking titanium actuators with manual actuators with little tick marks on them. Mm-hmm. The modern version of that is to use a robot, just like a little KUKA arm you might see at building cars at the Tesla factory. This small robot arm can show you the trajectory that you intended from the pre-op MRI and establish a very rigid holder through which you can drill a small hole in the skull and pass a small rigid wire deep into that area of the brain that's hollow, and put your electrode through that hollow wire and then remove all of that except the electrode. So you end up with the electrode very, very precisely placed far from the skull surface. Now that's standard technology that's already been out in the world for a while. Neuralink right now is focused entirely on cortical targets, surface targets, because there's no trivial way to get, say, hundreds of wires deep inside the brain without doing a lot of damage. So your question, what do you see? Well, I see an MRI on a screen. I can't see everything that DBS electrode is passing through on its way to that deep target. And so it's accepted with this approach that there's going to be about 1 in 100 patients who have a bleed somewhere in the brain as a result of passing that wire blindly into the deep part of the brain. That's not an acceptable safety profile for Neuralink. We start from the position that we want this to be dramatically, maybe 2 or 3 orders of magnitude safer than that. Safe enough, really, that you or I, without a profound medical problem, might on our lunch break someday say, yeah, sure, I'll get that. I've been meaning to upgrade to the latest version. Yeah. And so the safety constraints given that are high. And so we haven't settled on a final solution for arbitrarily approaching deep targets in the brain.
It's interesting because you have to avoid blood vessels somehow. You have to, maybe there's creative ways of doing the same thing, like mapping out high resolution geometry of blood vessels, and then you can go in blind. But how do you map out that in a way that's super stable? There's a lot of interesting challenges there, right?
Yeah.
But there's a lot to do on the surface, luckily.
Exactly. So we've got vision on the surface. We actually have made a huge amount of progress sewing electrodes into the spinal cord as a potential workaround for a spinal cord injury that would allow a brain-mounted implant to translate motor intentions to a spine-mounted implant that can affect muscle contractions in previously paralyzed arms and legs.
That's mind-blowing. That's just incredible. So like the effort there is to try to bridge the brain to the spinal cord to the peripheral nervous system. So how hard is that to do?
We have that working in very crude forms in animals.
That's amazing.
Yeah, we've done
so similar to like with Noland, where he's able to digitally move the cursor. Here you're doing the same kind of communication, but with the actual effectors that you have.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So we have anesthetized animals doing grasp and moving their legs in a sort of walking pattern. Again, early days, but the future is bright for this kind of thing, and people with paralysis should look forward to that bright future. They're going to have options.
Yeah, and there's a lot of sort of intermediate or extra options where you take like an Optimus robot, like the arm, and to be able to control the arm.
Yeah,
the fingers, the hands, of the arm.
Sure.
As a prosthetic. For example,
exoskeletons are getting better too.
Exoskeletons. Yeah, so that goes hand in hand. Although I didn't quite understand until thinking about it deeply and doing more research about Neuralink, how much you can do on the digital side. So there's digital telepathy.
Yeah,
I didn't quite understand that you can really map the intention, as you described in the hand knob area, that you can map the intention. Just imagine it, think about it. That intention can be mapped to actual action in the digital world.
right.
And now more and more, so much can be done in the digital world that it can reconnect you to the outside world. It can allow you to have freedom, have independence if you're a quadriplegic.
Yeah.
That's really powerful. Like you can go really far with that.
Yeah. Our first participant he's incredible. He's breaking world records left and right.
And he's having fun with it. It's great.
Yeah.
Just going back to the surgery, your whole journey, you mentioned to me offline you have surgery on Monday. So you're doing surgery all the time.
Yeah.
Maybe the ridiculous question, what does it take to get good at surgery?
Practice, repetitions. Same with anything else. There's a million ways of people saying the same thing and selling books saying it, but do you call it 10,000 hours? Do you call it, spend some chunk of your life, some percentage of your life focusing on this, obsessing about getting better at it? Repetitions, humility, recognizing that you aren't perfect at any stage along the way, recognizing you've got improvements to make in your technique, being open to feedback and coaching from people with a different perspective on how to do it. And then just the constant will to do better. That fortunately, if you're not a sociopath, I think your patients bring that with them to the office visits every day. They, force you to want to do better all the time.
Yeah, just step up. I mean, it's a real human being that you can help.
Yeah.
So every surgery, even if it's the same exact surgery, is there a lot of variability between that surgery and a different person?
Yeah, a fair bit. I mean, a good example for us is the angle of the skull relative to the normal plane of the body axis of the skull over hand knob is pretty wide variation. I mean, some people have really flat skulls and some people have really steeply angled skulls over that area. And that has, consequences for how their head can be fixed in sort of the frame that we use, and how the robot has to approach the skull. And people's bodies are built as differently as the people you see walking down the street. As much variability in body shape and size as you see there, we see in brain anatomy and skull anatomy. There are some people who we've had to kind of exclude from our trial for having skulls that are too thick or too thin, or scalp that's too thick or too thin. I think, we have like the middle 97% or so of people, but you can't account for all human anatomy variability.
How much like mushiness and mess is there? Because I, taking biology classes, the diagrams are always really clean and crisp. Neuroscience, the pictures of neurons are always really nice and very. But whenever I look at pictures of like real brains, they're all, I don't know what is going on.
Yeah.
So how much are biological systems in reality? Like, how hard is it to figure out what's going on?
Not too bad. Once you really get used to this, that's where experience and skill and education really come into play. Is if you stare at 1,000 brains, it becomes easier to kind of mentally peel back the, say, for instance, blood vessels that are obscuring the sulci and gyri, kind of the wrinkle pattern of the surface of the brain. Occasionally, when you're first starting to do this and you open the skull, it doesn't match what you thought you were going to see based on the MRI. And with more experience, you learn to kind of peel back that layer of blood vessels and see the underlying pattern of wrinkles in the brain and use that as a landmark for where you are.
The wrinkles are a landmark? So like...
Yeah. So I was describing hand knob earlier. That's a pattern of the wrinkles in the brain. It's sort of this sort of Greek letter omega shaped area of the brain.
So you could recognize the hand knob area? Like if I show you 1,000 brains and give you like 1 minute with each, you'd be like, yep, that's that.
Sure.
And so there is some uniqueness to that area of the brain, like in terms of the geometry, the topology of the thing.
Yeah.
Where is it about in the...
It's so you have this strip of brain running down the top called the primary motor area. And I'm sure you've seen this picture of the homunculus laid over the surface of the brain, the weird little guy with huge lips and giant hands. That guy sort of lays with his legs up at the top of the brain and face, arm areas farther down, and then some kind of mouth, lip, tongue areas farther down. And so the hand is right in there, and then the areas that control speech, at least on the left side of the brain, in most people are just below that. And so any muscle that you voluntarily move in your body, the vast majority of that references that strip, or those intentions come from that strip of brain, and the wrinkle for hand knob is right in the middle of that. And
vision is back here?
Yep.
Also close to the surface?
Vision's a little deeper. And so, this gets to your question about how deep can you get. To do vision, we can't just do the surface of the brain. We have to be able to go in, not as deep as we'd have to go for DBS, but maybe a centimeter deeper than we're used to for hand insertions. And so that's, work in progress. That's a new set of challenges to overcome.
By the way, you mentioned the Utah array, and I just saw a picture of that, and that thing looks terrifying.
Yeah,
because it's because it's rigid, and then if you look at the threads, they're flexible. What can you say that's interesting to you about that kind of approach of the flexible threads to deliver the electrodes next to the neurons?
Yeah, I mean, the goal there comes from experience. I mean, we stand on the shoulders of people that made Utah arrays and used Utah arrays for decades before we ever even came along. Neuralink arose partly, this approach to technology arose out of a need recognized after Utah arrays would fail routinely because the rigid electrodes, those spikes that are literally hammered using an air hammer into the brain, those spikes generate a bad immune response that encapsulates the electrode spikes in scar tissue, essentially. And so one of the projects that was being worked on in the Anderson lab at Caltech when I got there was to see if you could use chemotherapy to prevent the formation of scar. It's like, things are pretty bad when you're jamming a bed of nails into the brain and then treating that with chemotherapy to try to prevent scar tissue. It's like, maybe we've gotten off track here, guys. Maybe there's a fundamental redesign necessary. And so Neuralink's approach of using highly flexible, tiny electrodes avoids a lot of the bleeding, avoids a lot of the immune response that ends up happening when rigid electrodes are pounded into the brain. And so what we see is our electrode longevity and functionality and the health of the brain tissue immediately surrounding the electrode is excellent. I mean, it goes on for years now in our animal models.